Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you all. I'm Carl Ulrich, and I'm the Vice Dean of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at Wharton. I also oversee the San Francisco campus. Many of you have been to Scale School events, so I'm going to give only the briefest description of what Scale School is. One of our alumni, it was actually Rick Thompson, I don't mind naming his name, pointed out several years ago to me that he felt that Wharton had comparative advantage in the tools and capabilities required to scale ventures, and that we really ought to try to stake that position out for the Wharton School. And that really led to the formation of Wharton Scale School, which in practice has been the series of roughly quarterly workshops like this. And the format that's evolved has worked pretty well, which was we pick some topic of interest, we get a faculty member to introduce the topic, we have a panel of alumni to discuss it, and then we leave plenty of time for discussion and for networking. So that's the basic idea. And this is, I don't know, we've done like 10 of them, so this is about the 10th of them. And if this is your first event, we really hope you'll stay connected and join us for subsequent events. So I want to make one administrative announcement before we kick off the event. So I think I have if you just hit the arrow key, see if, yeah, beautiful. So we're super lucky that next fall, I guess this fall, we will be hosting the Wharton Alumni Forum. And if any of you have attended those events globally, they're fantastic events. I mean, lots of glitz and lots of alums, really fun events. And so I just want you to save the date, October 1 and 2 next fall here in our fair city. So that's terrific. Okay, so let's get started. The way I'm going to do it, I'll introduce our moderator and discussant, and then he's going to speak for a while and then introduce the panel. So we're super lucky to have with us Ethan Mollick. Ethan is an associate professor in the management department. And Ethan and I have known each other for a long time. We share common background. We both are uber nerds, having been mostly educated at MIT. Yeah, exactly. So we're really nerdy guys. And Ethan is really genuinely a polymath. He's been an entrepreneur. He's worked as a management consultant. He's worked in gaming. He's designed his own games. He's a scholar. Is really an amazing guy and brings just incredible gusto and enthusiasm to his work. So just tremendous guy to have as a colleague. Ethan's real focus, and I would say his focus, has been on evidence-based entrepreneurship. And he's made the argument, I really like the argument, that Wharton can carve out a distinctive position as the school that really brings evidence to entrepreneurship, not just the usual mantras and stories about entrepreneurship, but true evidence. Let me give you one example. So Ethan recently wrote a paper that debunked the myth that you benefit from having a team as a startup. Now, no, don't throw tomatoes. It actually turns out that solo founders are at no disadvantage. In fact, he'll perhaps give us the details, a slight advantage relative to their to founders that have teammates. But Ethan goes and shows with evidence what are the best practices for entrepreneurship. And I'm going to close before I turn it over to him with one very strong recommendation, which I give regularly, which is there is one person that I follow on Twitter and read every tweet, and it's Ethan Mollick. And it's E Mollick, at E Mollick. And what Ethan does, he is an expert on social media and marketing, as you can see. But Ethan, let me give you the pitch. Ethan, it seems like 5 times a day, tweets an incredibly interesting, concise summary of some academic study in entrepreneurship and why you should care, often with a screenshot of the critical figure in the paper. It saves me mountains of times. I read none of those papers, but I follow Ethan. And I'm serious, this is really valuable stuff, probably the most valuable thing I follow on entrepreneurship. Okay, so with that, let's welcome Ethan Mollick.
Now, all right, that's good. I'm still loud, but in that vein, I actually have posted a Twitter feed with a bunch of links to the articles that I'll be discussing here. So if you want to read more about them, you can actually click on the links and follow that here. Don't trust me, as a general rule. So I'm really glad to be here. As you'll notice, we're talking about female founders and funders, and I am neither of those things, but I'm very excited that after I'm done talking, we have a panel where I am mostly going to stay quiet and ask good questions, and we have amazing female founders and funders to talk both about gender issues, but also just the amazing stuff that they're doing. So we'll go to that discussion when I'm done, but I want to give you a mini lecture because I'm a professor, that's what we do. We see an audience, we can't help ourselves. So I'm going to do that. You can ask questions here, but I will keep things moving so we can get as quickly as we can to the main attraction, which is the panel. But I want to talk a little bit about female founders and funders. It's been an area of a lot of interest throughout the entrepreneurship world, researchers recently, and we may not know this, but Wharton actually has probably the largest group of active researchers studying entrepreneurship of any university that you can think of. And so we have a lot of people actively doing this work, and gender has been a big part of many of our studies. So I'm going to highlight some work from me and from other people. I hope you'll find it interesting, but I want to start with the puzzle. 40% of founders, about 38% actually, of all businesses in the United States are founded by women. Okay, so what percentage of VC-backed companies have female co-founders? What do you think? 20%, okay? 30%, yeah. So somewhere between 2 and 8%, depending on how you count it, right? And that number, by the way, has been startlingly flat, right? This is not something that's getting better. When you see the stats that they're getting better, it's because people are counting companies with at least one female co-founder, which have been increasing slightly, but that are getting VC funding, but this has not been a growing number. And the real question is both why and why should we care? And hopefully, because many of you are in the room, you care. But the so what question is one of fairness and one of equity, but it goes beyond that. We actually have increasing evidence that this is also just dumb, right? Aside from just being something that's unfair, it also doesn't make sense. So I want to give you a really quick tour of some of the latest work showing you why it's dumb to not fund women. So the first of these is female founders. So our best evidence so far is that female founders perform at least as well as men. So some studies show higher performance, some studies show no difference in performance. And again, we have to control for things because women don't get VC as much. VC helps increase your chance of exit by between 200 to 600%. So we have to kind of take that into account. But when you look at people who do get funding, women and men perform at least equally. And what's really been interesting is we've finally been able to quantify the fact that female inventors actually do invent in areas that men don't invent in. So one of the things you'll get to hear from one of our panelists who's literally launched a startup aimed at issues for women that's science-based. One of the things that bringing in diverse groups of entrepreneurs does is allow you to target new markets that no one's targeted before. So one reason that it's dumb to not fund more women is because you would actually make more money funding more women, and we are losing opportunity by not funding more women. Okay, so that's the funder side, right? This is Scale School, so we want to also talk about teams beyond the founders. So for startup teams, there's a bunch of really interesting new studies, and it's early on. This is one out of China, and don't worry, you don't have to parse all the arrows. It just makes it look very sciencey. But the short version of this is that the closer teams were to 50-50 gender balance, and this was a study in China, the more innovative the team was, and the more likely they were to get the benefits of other kinds of diversity on the team. Right, so gender balance seems to help teams become more innovative and more diverse. I will say that as the teams got to mostly women, you had the same downside. So it was actually getting closer to 50-50 was the key, not necessarily running all female teams. We have less evidence on that one way or another. So okay, that's the team side. And then the last piece of evidence is on the funder side. And I quote this tweet in my tweets, but I think it's interesting. There's so few female VCs that the best way we've been able to study, and this is Paul Gompers who's done this, about what the impact of funding more women from a venture capital perspective is to look at male VCs who have daughters, because once they have a daughter, they're more willing to fund other women, right? That's how few female VCs there are. But female VCs, and it's crazy because female VCs, as far as we could tell, have higher IRRs. And the study found that it increased the number of female VCs by 10%, which is from a startling low 8% to 18%, so we're not talking about equity here, would increase the amount of money being raised by VCs by over $23 billion. So money is being left on the table everywhere, right? And that's weird because we're here at Wharton, which to sort of I have a friend at Harvard Business School who calls his school the West Point of capitalism, but if we're not the West Point, then West Point, we're probably the Naval Academy of capitalism. We think it's important to at least have, that the market should sort these things out, but it's not doing that, right? So why? And that becomes a really big question, and one that I want to try and answer. And the answer has been depressingly lots of reasons. Okay, so we're not going to go into all of them today, but the evidence we have is that women are less likely to start companies than men, and that's partially due to preferences. It's partially due to family pressure. So in countries that have better childcare, women actually start less companies, but they start more high-growth companies. So there's a choices about what companies to launch and when to launch them. Women are more likely to be forced into launching a startup to make extra money or to make up for a shortfall. Women also tend to start more companies in things like retail and food, where VCs have historically made less investment, right? So there's a lot of reasons that have to do with the sourcing side of things. It's not all just a bias issue, though bias plays a role in that. But there are all these sort of funder biases as well. So we know that when women presented from a venture capitalist, if those are male panels, men ask different questions from women than men. So they ask women questions about how they're going to avoid loss, and they ask men questions about how they're going to win. Right? So we actually have a lot of evidence about these kind of biases that play out in the decision-making process. There is some evidence that some of those biases are getting better, but that only helps somewhat, right? Because there's a lot of other reasons here that are causing this concern. And one of the things I want to try and deliver, a lot of these talks about gender and entrepreneurship end up kind of being depressing because it's like things are bad. I want to try and offer at least a couple ways that things can be better. So I want to focus on a couple things that I think we can change or improve. One of those is about the mechanism by which you get VC. So venture capital is very much driven by networks. So a warm introduction is 14 times more likely to get you VC than a cold introduction. So having someone introduce you or know a connection to you makes a huge difference, right? And VCs, for historical reasons, have been mostly a white male network, right? Mostly from very top schools. And what's been nice is if you're at a top school, you might you still might get access now, even if you're not a white man, but it's still very top school oriented, very white male oriented. And even if you yourself are personally want to see as many female founders as possible, if your network is mostly people like you, and one of the basic principles of sort of human interaction is one of homophily. We like people who are like us, so our friends tend to be like us, so our networks tend to be like us, and those people's networks tend to be like them, and it freezes out women, right? So a male network tends to become male-dominated, even if the individual members of that network wish they could invest in more women. They'll ask, well, no female funders are ever coming to me. No female founders are ever coming to me. Why not? Because they don't know any women. And they're legitimate. When they say we don't know women entrepreneurs, they actually don't, right? They're frozen out of this network in a very deep kind of way. So one of the solutions people have proposed is, what if we have more female VCs? Right? They're only 8% now, hopefully a higher number in the future. Do we get the same sort of effect, right? Do we get a positive view? So I want to talk about two research projects I've done looking at some of these issues. The first one uses data from Kickstarter, so I do a lot of work on crowdfunding. And what's really interesting about Kickstarter is, opposed to any other way that women and men raise funding, women outperform men on Kickstarter. So the same project created by a woman versus a man is 13% more likely to succeed on Kickstarter if it was founded by a woman than by a man. And we wanted to explore, my co-author Jason Greenberg and I wanted to explore why this was the case. And what we thought was, maybe it's because on Kickstarter there are categories like fashion or children's book publishing that are women-dominated. So maybe that's why women are succeeding in these women-dominated categories. So this is what we found that was actually surprising. So this shows you at the bottom the percentage of backers, which is investors from each category, who are women. So 57% of fashion backers are women, 54% of children's book publishers are women, film is 50-50, tech projects 80% men, games 80% men. So you can see women have an advantage. That's the orange bar across the whole thing. But when we statistically looked at this, we found a surprise. Be ready for my big special effect. There we go. It was technology and games that were driving the difference. That's where women were so dominant. And that was weird, because why were women so dominant in these categories where there are actually very few women backers? So we wanted to explore this issue. So we started to think that maybe this had to do with literally the fact that there were so few women. Maybe women were actually trying to help each other out when they were at a collective disadvantage. It's the same way that, if for those of you who are Wharton alumni, if you're in a room full of Wharton people, the fact that you're at Wharton doesn't actually matter very much. I mean, you'll hold it in your heart, obviously, but the fact that everyone else around you is from Wharton means that there's no connection there, right? But if you happen to be somewhere where there's no other Wharton people and you meet even a vague colleague who's an alumni, suddenly that connection's really relevant. In the same way, where there might be very few women, maybe there's more connection between the women there. We call this activist choice homophily, the idea that I actually care and actively seeking out people like me because there's so few of us. So we did a study. We took a project from Kickstarter. This was a highly funded project. And we created two versions of this. Meet on top Jessica Smith and Michael Smith. Most popular name for millennials, right? Jessica and Michael Smith. Jessica and Michael, you can actually use this as useful science for you guys. They're exactly equally attractive. Okay, so there's actually a Princeton attractiveness lab. These are equally attractive people. You can calibrate your own sense of attractiveness by looking at these people and deciding who you think is hotter. That tells you something about yourself, okay? Equally attractive. Same t-shirt, same smile, same direction, right? So all we did, same project, and some of them were created by Michael Smith, some were created by Jessica Smith. And then we measured this activism idea, this idea that did you think it was important to help other women out, or did you think there was important to step in when there was a disadvantage? So we found something interesting. We found that men didn't care whether it was created by women or men. There was no big difference. But for women, it was really interesting. If you were not an activist, and 2/3 of women didn't think it was important to help other women out, if you weren't an activist, you thought the project created by a man was better, right? Keep in mind, there's no change. You were just shown one of these two. So we're looking at it statistically. The project created by a man was better, even though there was no change in the project. If you were an activist, you actually thought the project created by the woman was better, right? If you were aware of this kind of gap, and you were more likely to fund the project, right? So in the other cases, funding wasn't affected. In this case, it was. So only about 1/3 of women fit into this activist category. But those that did were the ones responsible for this funding gap. So what does that tell you? That tells you that as much as I'd like to say that you can help, that this problem could be helped by men acting differently, and I think we do need to, there's also this piece that seems to be that the uplift comes from women helping each other to some degree, right? And that seemed to explain part of the gap here in funding between women and men and why women were more successful, but that not all women were equally helpful in funding. In fact, there's some evidence that most female VCs actually fund women at a lower rate than male VCs, right? So it's not just gender, it's also intention that matters in these cases too. So thinking about that kind of piece. So the problem with all of this stuff, right, is that all of this stuff is together. It's what we call a wicked problem, a hard problem, lots of complex interacting things. So another study I did with Valentina Asanova, another one of my new colleagues at Wharton who's doing absolutely amazing work on international entrepreneurship, we decided to try and figure out more closely what was causing the gender gap, right? So in this case, we started with homophily, but what was causing the issue? Why were women getting less money than men? And we decided to do this using a simulation. So I have a game I created, and I build a lot of games for teaching. I've written a book on it. Actually launched this thing called Wharton Interactive, which are a game publishing arm here at Wharton. So we're doing more and more game-based teaching. But this is a game called the Startup Game. And the startup game basically puts people in the role of either founders of companies, investors in companies, or potential early employees. And they just make deals in the room. So those of you who took 801 with me, hello, then I see a number of hands waving. You've played the startup game. I don't tell people about this study while they're playing it because it's too depressing, but I'll show you it now. So 26,000 people around the world have played this game, and many different business schools, 38 countries. And what's interesting about the game is because when you come here, you're randomized into a role, right? We have made up companies. This is a company we made up called the Duck Blind. Anyone can run with this idea. It is a social network for hunters that sends you a gun camera and automatically posts your pictures to the web. Anyone who wants to launch it, see me later. And every one of these companies had very similar characteristics. Every one of the companies, for example, has a $100 million 5-year revenue projection, right? Because we're Silicon Valley. And every one of them has sort of similar kind of features. And so all of the arguments I gave you earlier about why women might not, why you might discriminate against women because they launch different kinds of companies than men, or even if it's benevolent statistical discrimination where you say there's not many women out there who succeed, so I'm not going to fund women for that reason, none of those things apply here, right? Because we're randomly selecting whether women or men get these companies. They're all MBA students or undergrads or executive MBAs in a room across the world. So all of those gaps I told you shouldn't matter, right? You're randomly assigned a company. People are randomly assigned to the funding role. So let's look at what happens. What happened is that women get 11% lower valuation than men playing this game, right? So if a man runs the same company versus a woman, 11% gap, which is kind of terrifying because there's literally nothing here. We've taken out every aspect of legitimate discrimination. right? And so the question was, why was there an 11% gap? And it turned out that it came down entirely to men not valuing female companies as highly. It wasn't negotiation. Men were willing to invest in female companies. It's just when there was a chance to value it, they valued it less, right? And it's sort of an irreducible kind of piece that we can't get around, which is, we're still kind of exploring it, but there just seems to be men don't want to invest in female companies. So also bad news, right, from a large perspective. There was an interesting bright light, though, which is what's interesting about this game is, as opposed to running in the real world where 8% of women are VCs, over the course of the games and the thousands of people playing them, we could observe different distributions of how many women were venture capitalists in the game. And what we found was something really interesting, which was the more women that there were in the game, the more that discrimination against women stopped and then reversed. So the magic number was somewhere around, somewhere between 25 and 40% of funders were women. Then you started to have evening out. In fact, every 1% more women added to the team increased the amount of money that was invested in women by 157%. So it's a really big impact, right? But it only came from having more female funders. Without more female funders, the gap persisted, right? So, on one hand, bad news, right? I don't have an easy answer. There's no simple switch you can flip. There's no single thing you could do as a woman that will change the nature of sort of venture capital. I do think there's growing awareness at the individual level. I think the problem is at the societal level. But it does show that as we slowly add more female funders, and if they support each other, we can start to enter something like a virtuous cycle, right? More female VCs equal more female-led startups, which lead to more successful female exits, more female role models, more women entering the space, and changes in expectation. And we already have some evidence of this. So it turns out one of the biggest predictors about entry onto entrepreneurship is actually having a family member who is a parent who's a founder. And really nice, some really clean recent research look at large-scale census data found something interesting. So it turns out that when your father is an entrepreneur, then it has relatively little effect on the propensity of daughters to become entrepreneurs, but a big propensity on sons to become entrepreneurs. If your mother is an entrepreneur, daughters are much more likely to become entrepreneurs and has much less effect on the son. And the key age, by the way, seems to be 8 to 14, seems to be where this influence is highest. Right? So if we can kickstart these cycles where women start to feel like startups are okay and they start to fund them and we have more role models, that's very successful. It's also interesting because it kind of is an individual versus collective story. I have other research that seems to show that women are more realistic about their business chances than men. So one of the biggest predictors of entrepreneurial entry, not success but entry, is overconfidence, right? Entrepreneurship is predicted by hubris. Why? Because this is a rock star game, right? Very small number of people make a lot of money and most people fail. So you have to believe you're amazing compared to everybody else. And if you're at Wharton, you obviously are. But in the outside world, it's not always true. So hubris predicts entrepreneurial entry. And there's a really well-known psychological fact that's common across the world called the male hubris, female humility effect, which shows that women have lower levels of hubris than men. So women make less attempts at entrepreneurship, which is rational individually because they more accurately assess the market. But it means they're buying less lottery tickets, so there's less successful women out there who win the lottery, forming less mentors and less role models and less investors. So it's a cycle that is a hard one to break, but we're starting to get some of the keys here as we do the research. And again, I want to end with that point saying that as far as we can tell, women are at least as good actual founders as men. And they do find innovations in areas that men do not. Right? And they seem to be very successful. So the only thing holding us back is some of these old funding mechanisms. Things like crowdfunding offer some hope and success. Getting access to networks through places like Wharton also seems to increase success rates. And so we're still actively studying this, right? But it's a really interesting kind of challenging area. And rather than me continuing to explain this to you, I want to bring up people who actually live through this world on a regular basis up for our panel discussion here. And we can take questions there. And if you have questions at the end about some of the research, I'll bring that into we'll have a Q&A at the end where we'll talk to the panelists, but I'm also happy to answer questions. Okay, so thank you very much. And with that being said, let's bring up our panelists. Okay. So I'm really, really happy to be here with such a distinguished panel. And what I'm going to do is let everyone do a kind of quick introduction of themselves. I would love just talk about your journey and what you're with now, what you're doing. And then we'll sort of talk about gender issues, but I don't want to focus just on sort of the negative, positive sides of gender is not the only thing to discuss here. I want to talk about diversity as we move up and just your general feelings as entrepreneurs in this space. So I'll let you start with the introductions, Iris.
Sure. I'm Iris Choi. I'm a partner at Floodgate. We're a seed stage fund based in the Bay Area. Seed stage, for those of you who aren't as familiar with the venture ecosystem, is basically the first institutional round of money that most entrepreneurs raise. I'm also a very proud MBA alum of Wharton. My path to where I am currently is that, so I graduated from Wharton in 2004. Prior to Wharton, I had done 5 years in investment banking, early stage venture capital. Post-Wharton, I was actually an investment banker again with Goldman Sachs out here in San Francisco, primarily around M&A for technology and media companies, and have now been with Floodgate for 7 years working with early stage companies.
Hi everyone, I'm Lulu, co-founder and CEO of Elix. We are the first hormonal health brand to personalize herbal medicine for women's issues, beginning with menstrual health. And my journey to this venture is actually very personal. It started about 3 years ago, laying on the bathroom floor, unable to move my body because for the first time in my life, I was experiencing debilitating menstrual cramps that felt like someone was repeatedly stabbing me in the uterus. I had been on hormonal birth control for 16 years, and all of a sudden, when I first went off, that's when the symptoms started. And I realized I'm not alone. Up to 90% of women in the US experience menstrual symptoms at some point in our lives. And for 25 to 30% of women, the pain is so severe, it causes absenteeism from work and school. Yet it's still something that's very embarrassing, shameful to talk about, which leads to 46% of women being afraid to tell our employers when we're experiencing these symptoms. And so when we do end up calling in sick from work or school, we blame it on maybe an upset stomach or a migraine headache or another symptom altogether. And so we're really excited after 2 years of beta testing, R&D, really incubating this business during my MBA at Wharton, that we raised our first venture-backed round last fall and soft launched earlier this month, actually. And we've now had over 5,000 women take our online health assessment to learn more about their menstrual cycle, how it connects to their overall health. And of the women who've tried our personalized herbal remedies, 93% have reported an improvement in pain and or symptoms after the first month. So we are just beginning, and we are excited to be on our way to serving millions of women who are currently underserved in this market.
Amazing.
And what do you do?
My name is Naama Moran. I'm from Israel originally. I'm super excited to have Iris on my board and inviting me here. I hardly made it through high school. I actually dropped out of high school, hardly made it through college, definitely don't have an MBA, so I'm sorry, I might not relate to some of that experience. And I am probably running a company in a field that has probably the least female founders you can imagine in logistics. Cheetah is my company I co-founded and is basically an app that enables small businesses to order their supplies and get them delivered next day. We primarily work with restaurants and food service businesses. They can download our app at any point in time and basically place order for next day delivery. We deliver everything a restaurant needs to operate, from produce and meat to packaging and cleaning supplies. We currently operate 2 fulfillment centers, one in the Bay Area, another one in LA. We're going to launch a third one in Dallas in April. And yeah, excited to be here. Thank you for, really interesting, by the way. I have to credit my father for inspiring me. My mother is the least risk-taking person I can imagine. She still asks me to quit. My father, however, died of a heart attack, so that also tells you something of the risk you have to take as an entrepreneur. But he did inspire me. He was a small business owner, and also one of the reasons I end up serving small business owners in this business.
Excellent. I'm really excited to have you all here, and there's a lot of discussions to have. But kind of keeping on the theme from earlier, where we talked about founders and employees and funders, let's go one level higher, which is the boards of directors, right? So that's been an area where there's been lots of kind of conflict and push back and forth. And Iris, I know you sit on boards as a venture capitalist. Can you tell us about some of your experiences with gender on sort of boards of directors?
Yeah, it's funny, on my way here, I was trying to think through, I would say I sit on or am very involved on 8 boards of portfolio companies that we've invested in, of which at least 5 of them, I'm the only female on the board. And I feel like a lot of times the reason that's given is, especially the early stages, like if you look at NAMA's board, there are a couple seats for the founders, but then usually the rest of the room is filled with venture capitalists. And given the statistics you shared, there aren't that many women in VC. And so if it's primarily VCs on your board, the statistics are going to show you that it's primarily going to be men. But I was surprised in that I recently joined as a board observer, a company that just raised their Series C round. And when I wasn't able to fly in for the board meeting, so I zoomed in, the video went live, and I thought to myself, oh yes, of course, it's another room full of men. And it's funny because given I had an entire career in investment banking before I started my career in venture, I have become a little bit numb to the concept of realizing that I'm the only woman in a room. And so it was interesting to me to realize that I did take notice of it. And I think a lot of that is because of the emphasis that's been happening over the last couple of years about wanting to have diversity in the room, especially at the board level, and really thinking about the fact that there is a stage at which that excuse of most of my board members are VCs is no longer applicable because it's probably in the best interest of your company to have a more diverse perspective. You know, I'm a big believer in our companies either cycling through their VCs or having independent board members and people who bring a lot of value in a different perspective. And that doesn't have to be just based on gender. I'm very clear about that. But thinking through whether or not you can have other people that are willing to engage with you, debate you, and help you see where your own blind spots are as well.
Excellent. So that's, and we can come back to that thread because I think it's really interesting. Nama, you were talking about your sort of fundraising experience. As you know, did gender play a role in that process for you, or?
Yeah, I mean, you want to?
It's your story.
Yeah, I mean, I was just saying earlier that you know, I worked in finance too, and I think that's actually a world where I did feel some of the implications of being a woman a lot more than as a founder. Thankfully, I haven't had any, I didn't never feel that being a woman was a disadvantage. The only exception is really when I was pregnant and I was fundraising, it was a couple of years ago. And in fact, I actually recommend for you to Google Nama Moran pregnant, and you'll find an article that my co-founder at the time, was a male, wrote about my experience, and it was really awesome. He wrote it much better than I can tell it. It was the only time where I felt that, oh, that is a real thing, and it was when I was on the phone with one of my seed investors. The company was a seed stage company, and I was pregnant, I was telling him I'm going to fundraise, and he said, did you think about what it means for you to actually go out and fundraise as you're pregnant? I'm like, no, what does it mean? He's like, well, people will probably be more reluctant to give you money because you're pregnant, they realize you're going to leave. I'm like, oh shoot, you're right, man, it's probably what's going to happen. And that's what I said. I was so oblivious to that. And I think this is the problem of women, is that we, especially like alpha women like me, we don't even think that the fact that we're a woman could be a problem. There is a bias. Only then I read there was a research you probably know from where, maybe it was an HBS research, that actually compared women giving a pitch and men giving the same pitch, and they actually revealed those biases. And I was like, wow, that's a real thing. And then I started getting interested. And in fact, that investor, I actually thanked him. I wasn't upset at him at all. I was like, that's right, maybe that would be an issue. And my answer to him actually, by the way, was, that's probably going to be a bias. At the same time, it's going to work in my favor because I don't want to work with investors who don't want to work with a female founder. So I will be just filtering them out naturally. And this is how I totally feel about it, and I'm very confident. But it was really interesting how a male investor actually brought it up for me. And that made me wonder truly like how much of a disadvantage I did have. How many no's I received, which are ostensibly because I'm too early or I'm too this or too that, are actually coming because there is a bias. And frankly, I didn't do much about it because I don't think I can. Maybe you can, like a professor like you. The only thing I can do is just to be successful and be just like another dot, on the graph that shows that we can make it. But I don't think too much about these things. When I go into a meeting, I'm just there to succeed. I don't care about the fact I'm a woman. I'm a person. And that's how I feel about it.
That's great. And I love that point. I mean, I've had, again, not female and didn't raise VC, but I've had two of my students come to me separately and tell me that they were asked during VC pitches what birth control they were on. So it's not, and this was in the last couple of years, so this is not a dead issue at this point in any way. So I want to switch from a little bit gears here, and sort of one of the things I tried to emphasize in the talk was women have advantages also, right? So Lulu, one of the interesting things is you're targeting, you're sort of the vanguard of female-led, female-focused ventures at female issues. Tell us a little bit about how that has sort of played out and how that changes your approach. Are people receptive to that? Do you have to do more education? How do you think through that issue?
Well, we learned a lot about finding the right investors, and clearly not all investors are made equally. So in I would say the early days, our first couple weeks of fundraising, when we had no idea what we were doing and just taking meetings with anyone who wanted to meet with us, we definitely had experienced our share of offhand comments, such as men asking me, well, what does your husband do for a living? Is he going to be able to support you as you're going through this journey? I was like, is that something that you would actually ask me if this wasn't my gender? But the real challenge for us was addressing a need that many investors themselves may not experience. If 92% of investors are male, don't menstruate, will never experience menstrual pain, how do we really communicate the size of this opportunity and the potential of our business model? And I mean, honestly, I think that's where the Wharton Education and the other bias we were dealing with was people who don't believe in herbal remedies and herbal medicine. They believe that everything on the market is snake oil. And I remember in entrepreneurship, 806 or one of them, I can't remember the numbers, Carl advised us early on to really lean into the research on the efficacy of what we're doing. My co-founder is a doctor of Chinese medicine. We surveyed 246 clinical trials and studies, and there's real proof of what we're doing having a medicinal level impact. And then really leaning into numbers on market size, on our traction. And in addition to kind of speaking to the data and the numbers, it was really finding those communities we were talking about earlier. I firmly believe there's never been a better time in history to be a female founder. We're part of The Wing. It's a women's only co-working space and networking group, and also Allraise, which Iris's fund is a founding member. Allraise is dedicated to advancing female founders and gaining access to venture capital. And so I'm just really grateful for these new burgeoning communities, and I'm based in New York. There's very strong collective of female founders, such as Audrey Gilman, who regularly hosts breakfasts, because I think this new generation of female founders really believe that, as Audrey says, they're the tip of the spear, and as they are able to raise $78 million rounds, and as they're able to achieve success, they become the role models that future generation of founders can look to and believe that this is achievable, this is possible, and they themselves are the ones sharing resources, opening that book of contacts and networks, and sharing lessons learned on how they got through the process, and really encouraging that culture of helping to lift each other up, passed down through next generations of founders.
That's great. So I want to pick up on something that Iris was talking about earlier, which was sort of the benefits of diversity, right? And not just gender diversity, but viewpoint diversity and other kinds of approaches. And I think if there's one sort of decisive theme of the research is diversity helps innovation, but diversity can be challenging because it both is hard to get diversity because we like people like ourselves, and also diversity, part of the reason why diversity makes you more innovative is it creates conflict, right? Often productive conflict, but there's still some sort of conflict of viewpoints. So as we're at Scale School here, and you either help companies scale or you're scaling yourselves, how are you thinking about maintaining diversity, whether we're talking about gender or other kinds of diversity, as you scale your company, or is that something you're not worried about because you want to avoid the conflict issue? Talk to us a little bit about any of that. Whoever wants to lead off can start.
I can start, I'm happy to, which is that, we have the benefit, although it's also the result of intentional planning, which is of the 4 partners at Floodgate, 2 of us are women, 2 of us are men, and then we're actually ethnically fairly diverse as well. And so what I suspect is true of us is that we see more female founders in our deal flow and thus have backed more female founders. There was a period around the time when we invested in Nama's company Cheetah that one of my colleagues stopped and said, do you realize each of us has backed a female founder within the past 3 months? Right, and it wasn't it wasn't a quota that we had set out to do. It was just a reflection of our deal flow, and we back incredible people. And what their gender is, it was never a factor in our equation. And we had the benefit of being able to see the women that were actually in our deal flow. And I suspect for some of them, we may have felt more approachable because we have women in our partnership. And so a lot of these questions around, well, if one of the female founders is pitching is pregnant, my female colleague and I have multiple children, right? The concept of a woman who is also a mother being dedicated and working incredibly hard is not something that we have to ponder, right? We see it and work as those people every day. I don't think my male colleagues would ever doubt and my partner and then my dedication to the firm because we also have families. And so now actually as a firm, what we're trying to diversify is around age. Right, my 3 colleagues and I are kind of generally around the same age, and we realized there would be a benefit to bring in younger perspective, right? And also our younger network and be able to see deal flow of younger founders as well. So there's multiple aspects in which we're constantly trying to think about diversity and how we would benefit from it. And we're also very cognizant that you're right, a lot of that innovation and the difference in perspective can lead to what feels like conflict, but how do you actually work through that as well?
Excellent.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about diversity. So Cheetah, one of the most fun things about working actually in logistics and especially in technology-enabled logistics is that it really is incredibly diverse by definition. We have warehouse employees, which are coming from very different background than probably most of us here. We have engineers, we have data scientists and machine learning developers. We have salespeople that are coming right out of college. We have support people in the Philippines. We have just diversity built into who we are. And we are very focused in my company on promoting people from within. And so we are actively looking into how do we promote people from a warehouse picker into a manager, into hopefully getting into company management and so on. And in fact, we do have one person today that started, we have multiple people that started as pickers and became managers. We have one person that started as an operations manager and is basically taking a very important executive role in the company. And this is really awesome. And so I guess diversity is already part of the nature of the company, and then encouraging this cross-functional transfer is beneficial for us because it enables us to save on recruiting and onboarding costs because we can just promote from within. And at the same time, it's also very good because people that come from the ground operation into management is a lot more effective than bringing someone from the outside. So it's this kind of like a virtuous cycle that feeds on itself. And then for me personally, I just love what this gives me, the perspective that it gives me as a person. For example, like I think a lot of tech companies in the Bay Area are aware of the income inequality that we all have, but I actually see it every day because I interact with people who are kind of in the bottom of the feeding funnel, and I see what it means to the economy. This is something I'm very grateful for. I didn't have it in my previous tech-only jobs. I only knew about it as a news item. And then also interacting with people from across the world is another great opportunity for me, just to have better empathy into, like the power dynamics, like working even with teams in the Philippines. What does that mean for them to work with us, and what does it mean for us to work with them? And we're actually very focused on that, not just being an outsourced operation. We're turning these people into employees of the company, enabling them to be part of our culture, giving them health insurance. The type of reward you're getting for these kind of things is just incredible. So there's a tremendous amount of benefits in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. So we think about diversity in terms of obviously gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic background, which we were talking about, ambitions, viewpoints, backgrounds, skills, experiences, and so forth. And so in my previous history, I worked in management consulting focused on consumer healthcare and retail, and a lot of work around organizational change and transformation and culture. And one of the biggest challenges with building in diversity starts with hiring and interviewing. If you're not getting a diverse pool of candidates in your interview pipeline, you're not going to be hiring those people, and you're not going to be building a culture of that. And yet we know that the interview process is filled with so many unconscious biases. And so we try to remove those, starting with our online application. We have a very simple per functional area type form survey where we're really able, and where we don't even have the person's name. So we can't even guess like what gender or what racial ethnicity you are. But we're purely able to look. So currently, if anyone in the audience is interested, we have an opening for content and community manager director. You can find the opening at elixhealing.com. Subtle plug. But basically, depending on the functional area, we have a couple of very simple questions just to get an understanding of what your potential in that role is. What are your ideas that you could bring to the table? And the reason why it's so important to focus on a candidate's ideas and potential is because when you focus on someone's education, background, and experiences, that in and of itself is discriminatory, because if someone hasn't been able to go on and get that Ivy League education or go into the prestigious management, consulting, or banking jobs, then even if they have so much amazing potential and ambition, they're going to be filtered out through a traditional interviewing process. And we're really proud that our first two hires are people we probably, using a traditional system, would have very easily filtered out, but they've already helped us see so many blind spots. Like our first hire, essentially one of her first pieces of feedback was, it's great that we're focused on women's health, but there are people with periods who may not identify as being female. And so how do we incorporate more gender neutral language? And or, it's great that we're solving this issue, but there might not be people who can't afford to pay for the solution but need it for themselves. So could we incorporate some type of social impact give back and or scholarship model? So those are just some examples of how having a diversity of perspectives can be really enriching.
Excellent. And just two quick researchy thoughts on what you're saying that both match exactly what you're saying. One of those is that interviewing process is so critical. One of the interesting findings recently has been badly designed, unstructured interviews are literally destructive to hiring. So if you're not actually planning out the interview, you actually hire worse people as a result of having unstructured, unplanned interviews than not doing interviews at all, because you become convinced about the wrong sets of things about people. So hearing that well-designed is a really important thing. And then also on the age side, I like that you're skewing younger, but we have another colleague at Wharton, Danny Kim, who's just did some research finding that the average age for a founder raising VC is 42, and the average age for a founder building a hypergrowth company is 45 to 59. So you don't have to skew too young, apparently. I think that's really great, and I want to, before we get to questions, just move one level up. So we started talking about personal experience and gender, and then we talked about diversity and scaling, but this is a scale school, so you're all successful entrepreneurs, so I wanted to move to sort of general scaling advice, right? So we were sort of joking before about how everyone gives the same advice to founders, but I think scaling, at least we start to have more, there's a lot of more advice diversity that we hear. So what's your advice to people who are thinking about scaling, or either how to scale now, or what to do before they scale, what to think about early on, and just what are your feelings on that?
Yeah, at Floodgate, we talk about going through like a mental maze, and what that means is that when you start a company, there are certain truths that you kind of hold to be self-evident, right? It's the reason why you started the company. But the question becomes, especially once you take on funding, so you have a little bit more flexibility about running experiments, how can you test that you're actually making progress and that you're not just busy being busy? And I think that's something that's important, to have that kind of discipline no matter what stage that you're at. So it's not just about, for example, revenue growth, because revenue growth is impressive, but is it coming at a cost that's not sustainable, right? What are the unit economics around the business that you're building? At some point, will you be able to get to profitability and be self-sustaining so that you're not always raising venture funding? And so I think that at whichever stage that you are at, including when you're scaling, it's important to have a dashboard of metrics where you're holding yourself accountable to seeing whether you or not you are making valid progress and in what direction.
I should go. So scaling, I think first answer is what to think about scaling before you need to scale. I would say don't think about scaling. Before you need to scale, all you need to think about is product market fit. That's, in my opinion, the only thing you need to do. It's a good problem when the market is calling you to scale and you're not ready, almost. Like, it's very few companies really failed because they were not ready to scale. And normally it can be fixed pretty quickly. So actually I would suggest that you don't think about what you need to do to scale if you're not ready to scale. Then you're thinking about the wrong thing. When you are ready to scale, my company has gone definitely through pretty significant growth over the last couple of years. You really just said like what I was about to say, like the dashboard of the core KPIs is incredibly important. Like at that point, you found product market fit, and all you want to understand is like, what is my dashboard? Like I'm driving this, like flying this airplane, I need to have a control board to manage it and understand exactly what are the levers. This is one thing. And the second thing is really the team. I know your research shows maybe that the team, perhaps in the early stage, is not as important, but I think in the scale stage, it is very important, because otherwise you can't scale as a CEO, pretty much. Like I would not be able to do what I'm doing without my team, period. I'm only doing it because of my team. And then this is very, very important, is really to figure out how to hire the right people for the role. I spend a lot of time on hiring people for executive positions. I just recently hired a head of people that basically we've been developing a relationship for a year and a half. That's extreme, and I wish I would have been able to hire faster, but it is kind of an area where I suggest that if you're in the scaling stage, you spend a lot of time on these kind of people, because the cost in investing into onboarding them and scaling them up is very high, and the cost of them leaving is incredibly high. And then on a personal level, one thing that I'm working with myself on, and I still have so much room for improvement, is time management. I literally just did another nth iteration today, like looking at the number of hours I have. Like we all have only 168 hours a week, and we normally sleep 50 hours, right? Like that's already gone. So what do you do with like those hours? How do you spend the time, and how do you do them? How do you spend those hours without burning out is very important for scaling, because it's very easy, especially for certain types like me, to just like think you'll solve it by working more and harder, but then it becomes about how do you work more effectively. And self-management is what I'm learning is key for my ability to scale right now. That's it.
So since I just graduated from the executive program at Wharton this past May, I often get asked by friends and fellow entrepreneurs, was it worth it to go to business school? Did you learn anything that you're actually applying towards what you're doing now?
We didn't pre-screen this, so I just want to be really careful about this answer.
And my reply is usually, I think the number one, well, I got a lot of things out of business school, lifelong friends, some of them are sitting over there, all of that. But I would say as it relates to entrepreneurship, just getting in the rigor of experimentation. was something that was really, I feel like, drilled into us in every single course, in every single program about it. And that really helped us in the early days because I feel like I came into business school with a very clear idea of what we were building and the problem that we were solving. And as we surveyed more people, as we talked to more people, as we prototyped, we started off as a powdered solution because the unit economics were amazing and it made operations and everything on the back end super seamless, but people hated it. It tasted like shit. I mean, the herbs that are really good for you are bitter as all hell, and we got feedback, and there were people who were trying to be nice and saying, oh, it's pretty awful, but if it works, I can take it. And then you, and those are people lying to you. And then you really monitor their behavior, and you realize that it's like, well, even if something is going to have a medicinal level effect, but someone has a gag reflex ingesting it, they're never going to take it, and we're going to have massive issues with adoption and adherence. So I guess it's just experimenting, observing, changing things, asking people why, even if they give you the answer that you wanted to hear and that you like to hear, asking why again, and then kind of drilling to the bottom of it, and just really trying hard to understand the day-to-day behaviors, the underlying needs of our consumer. Yes, we're getting rid of the symptoms, but so what? Okay, so you can be more productive when you're on your period, but so what? And so really getting to that higher level need that what we're building is solving, and also seeing the future potential of it. It was something that talking to more and more people and experimenting really helped us out with. And then I really agree with Naima about prioritization. We just implemented a sprint method to basically get hyper-focused on priorities for 2 to 3 week periods as a team. It's something that a lot of engineering teams do, and people are nodding, so I'm assuming you know what it is. But so that's really helped us. But something that I'm definitely still working on is celebrating the wins. Because as a startup, especially in the early days, it's like there's an endless amount of things that we want to achieve, we want to do, we want to fix these things that people are telling us are barriers to them having a better experience on our platform. But just recognizing that we're all human doing our best, and when we do have those wins and our life-changing testimonials, it's important to take a moment and just absorb that.
That's a great point to throw things out to questions. I wanted to clarify one thing, because Carl mentioned it, you mentioned it. Founding teams matter a lot. The research shows you don't need to have a co-founder to succeed. So venture capitalists demand you to get co-founders. It turns out there's not actually a lot of evidence, and in fact, single founders may be co-founders, but those single founders will often hire founding teams underneath them, right? Yeah. So teams matter hugely. That's all that I agree with you. Everything is about hiring and successful scaling, but you don't need to be necessarily afraid to start a company on your own. So, but I think this is wonderful advice. I've really been enjoying this. You guys must have questions, right? So either for the panelists or about the presentation, we'd love to answer them, especially for the panel. You have a button, I think, on your thing that will actually get everyone to hear you. I won't cold call yet, but even that's tempting. I see a crowd. I'm like, oh, you've got name tags. I can cold call. Who wants any questions for anyone here? Yes.
Oh, have to. Sorry. Question for Iris. You had mentioned that you invest in media and tech. So are there particular areas that you in particular are focusing on?
So we don't invest in tech and media. When I was at Goldman, I was a tech and media banker. No, it's okay. And now we're kind of like generalists within technology, but primarily software. And so that ranges from marketplaces, which is what Cheetah is, and I sit on the board of. We have a couple of theses right now that we're very focused on. One of them is around the solopreneur. And so what is the infrastructure that is necessary to help promote individual entrepreneurs? And we're actually thinking about solopreneurs as anyone, there's SMBs that are usually, 5 people and above, and solopreneurs are literally just the individual. So if you think about a gig economy worker, what if they actually want to make a career of their service, and how can they have a platform of their own where they have a CRM system and everything that like a small business would actually need? That's an area where we've been spending a lot of time. Vertical SaaS continues to be of interest to us. And so there's a couple of different theses that we're testing.
Great.
I'm really loud, so I'm going to...
Okay, hi. Okay, this question's for Lulu, actually. So, back when I was 7 years old, I used to wear goggles in my kitchen to cut onions while wearing sponges on my feet so that I could clean the floor. And my mom thought that was crazy, but turns out when I turned an adult, in Sur La Table, both of those are now an actual sale item, right? Sold item, right? Anyway, I bring that up because you've obviously hit on a pain point yourself and decided to address that. I frequently have come across such opportunities in my life. I would say pretty much on the decade over the decade, right? Now, in my 40s, I look back thinking about all those lost opportunities, and I wonder, what was it that finally got you to a point where you thought your personal problem was worth solving?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So I should probably back up to what I was actually doing 3 years ago. I had left consulting and I was recruited in-house to Saks Fifth Avenue and the parent company Hudson's Bay, running kind of an internal strategy group, change and transformation. And so when I was going through, and actually my personal journey to this, my grandfather actually ran a hospital in Hunan, China, and it was the hospital that I was born into. So I always grew up with herbal medicine and natural remedies as a way of life, and just always thought it was something really embarrassing about my upbringing because I was always drinking these like poopy colored, stinky smelling concoctions. But so long story short, at Saks, 70 to 80% of my colleagues were women. And yet, even being around such a female-dominated environment, I felt embarrassed and ashamed of the symptoms. But yet, my grandfather connected me with actually one of our advisors. He's one of the most prominent doctors of Chinese medicine who's written over 100 papers, 45 books. And he was the person who prescribed me a personalized herbal blend that literally the next month I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize I was bleeding. And I was so shocked at the results that I was telling everyone at work about this. And that was when so many of the women around me, we had never talked about our periods, started coming forward with their own stories of my friend Heather, who had the corner office. Once a month, she calls in sick for her migraines, but that was actually due to her period. My friend Allison, who had these really intense bloating and period poop conditions, but we never talked about it until then. And so it was initially just like that circle of women around me talking about it. So that piqued my interest. So then I started researching the stats and I was like, holy shit, up to 90% of women experience this, and 60% of women are on hormonal birth control pills to manage their menstrual symptoms. And beyond hormonal birth control, it's like you can down a bottle of Advil every month, but that's not a sustainable. So it was then like thinking about, okay, the market's massive, the current solutions really suck. Like, could we actually build something scalable that works? So I think it was like many months and a lot of time period of talking to people, digging into the research before really landing on, okay, like, and I did not decide day one I was going to do this. It was kind of like, oh, this is an interesting idea. Let me start to do the research. I think that's why the research, the experimentation, all of that was super critical. And then at some point, it was this nagging thing that wouldn't go away. And I thought about it all the time and felt like I couldn't do anything else. And this was the thing I needed to do. I don't know. It's irrational, right? We were talking about that at the beginning of this.
Excellent. But I will say, it's not irrational because you actually tested it, right? It's irrational to jump in and not do this, but experiments, which is something all of you have mentioned, have changed the equation here, right? So, focusing on doing experiments, learning about the market, you're underselling the story about how much work you kind of put in to test this step by step and put your feet in. And at some point you have to jump, but you get as much information as you can. And I mean, you were sort of famous for your presentations were amazing in school and everyone paid attention to you. So you were using all these opportunities to do things. You have to talk about your notorious tongue slide at some point. Yeah,
well, so Ethan brings this up because in Chinese herbal medicine, the tongue is the only external organ that's a visible indication of your internal health. So in order for us to do any type of mass personalization of Chinese herbal medicine, we had to figure out a way. The pulse was really difficult, so then we basically the last step of the online health assessment for Elix is you submit a photo of your tongue. And that was something that initially we thought, this is super weird. Are people actually gonna do it? And turns out people love giving us their tongue.
So it was one of the best early traction slides I ever saw, which was how people are interested. We're like, okay, they're interested. And then it was just a wall of tongues. And you were like, I don't know what to do with this. I'm uncomfortable. But on the other hand, it's clear somebody is interested in this product. So
We have a blog post about it. You can learn a lot about the state of your health by observing your tongue.
other questions?
Hello? Yes, hi, my name is Juliana. I have a question for Lulu. So I have a women empowerment organization in San Francisco, and a lot of our women often ask about how to incorporate these wellness initiatives and program at work and how important it is. Maybe you've had an experience with that. Maybe you've already tried reaching out to companies. What is their response?
I am so happy you asked that question because we were actually just quoted in the FEI journal, Financial Executives International, about this very topic. So we started piloting talks in the workplace because part of the mission of Elix is really to just spread education and awareness about the connection between menstrual health and our overall health and all the incredible things that we can do to stay healthy. And we recently did a talk at Google for Google Women, and it was incredible how the smartest engineers like in the world, these female engineers, like we don't talk about our menstrual health, and we have no idea like our estrogen, progesterone balance, and cramps. It's not just about how we're feeling on our periods, but it affects our mood, our sleep, our appetite, everything all month long. And so our call to action in that article for heads of HR and heads of wellness programs is to start more conversations, and our team is happy to come in and facilitate those conversations in person, New York, LA, San Francisco, and or virtually. And we're actually building out a network of holistic practitioners, acupuncture ambassadors, wellness dietitians, and so forth. And we really view these herbal remedies almost like your gateway into a whole body transformation, because I feel like today in health and wellness, it's overwhelming. You know, I've got to watch my carbs and my protein, I've got to meditate, I've got to go to yoga, I've got to get my strength training, my cardio, I've got to get sleep, I've got to drink water, and there's just so much to do to stay and be healthy. But if we can deliver a personalized remedy where someone's in debilitating pain 1 month and 2 or 3 months later that pain disappears, we view that as the gateway to start this whole new path towards a healthier, more sustainable lifestyle.
Excellent. Yes, in the back. You have to hold it down.
Hello. Okay, great. Hi. My question is for Nama. So I also work in a male-dominated industry in energy and engineering. And so for the people who know me, it's not a problem. The men love me, I love them. It's just like people in a room all kicking around ideas. Where I've run into some difficulty is people who don't know me. So future business partners, potential customers, potential investors that are men. I mean, when you're in a male-dominated industry, you just sort of run into them all the time. So what kind of strategies or what do you find yourself doing to establish yourself as an equal in the room for people who might not, maybe unconsciously as well, kind of have a bias against you as a woman?
Okay, so I think the first thing is what you feel inside is what you probably project outside. So first of all, I feel I'm unequal. And this is kind of the baseline. And I think this is really important. So I think if you or anyone here is finding themselves in a situation where after that they feel like, and it happens to me too, you know, by the way, where I feel like, I feel like I did not perform as well, or I was vulnerable and I lost my power, I ask myself what happened there. And in most cases, it's my own internal place where I was. And what you're seeing outside is a reflection of where you are. That's what I'm finding. However, after this kind of revelation, quote unquote, that I got when I was pregnant, I did, as I said, I did start researching what actually gives me advantages as a female entrepreneur. Like, if there's all those disadvantages, maybe there are some advantages. And so there is a professor, you probably know her name, she's a woman professor, and she actually researched how men react positively to women. So for example, one of the things that she says is that if a woman is pitching for funding and she says, I need it for my team, it's actually more likely she will get it as opposed to saying, I need it for myself. Actually, if a man says, I need it for myself, it is perceived more positively. So I basically said, well, I'll just take advantage of these biases rather than being a victim of these biases. So I started learning what are the biases I should use in my own advantage. And so these are the kind of things I'm doing. So I'm learning from people who've done research, like what are the things I need to do as a founder? If I'm asking for things that I actually needed for myself, first of all, I'm always trying to align my own needs with my team needs, period. But so it's also authentic, and no, I'm not just saying it, but I'm using this type of cues. Or, for example, I think it's a lot easier for me, maybe it's because I'm a female, or maybe it's just who I am, to let the other person talk about themselves. And men love to do that. So I just start the meeting, they talk about themselves, they open up, and boom, now you put them in a position where you can really close the sale. So that's essentially, my advice beyond, beyond like internal positioning. It's like, if there are biases, then like, why don't we take advantage of them?
Great.
Excellent.
Thank you. Oh, and also my father was also an entrepreneur. It made a big difference for me. So it's good to hear someone else has that too.
Excellent. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Deborah. This question's for Iris. So I work at a VC firm in a junior position with an all-male partnership. They're all very well-intentioned, very nice guys. And we are trying to push for, we're trying to make a big push for doing more in terms of diversity and inclusion. What are some of the things that you've done at Floodgate that you have seen have been effective? Are there metrics that you track? What are some best practices that we can learn from?
Well, I think the reality is that the more that they can empower you, that will have an impact, right? Because, Nama can speak to this probably better than I, but founders know when the person they're speaking to has check writing power and the ability to influence an outcome and an actual investment versus you are someone who's checking boxes and going through a diligence list before it gets elevated to someone else, right? And again, we have the benefit of 2 out of the 4 people that have a checkbook and can pound the table for a deal happen to be women. And so we probably see more deal flow than if we were an all-male partnership. So I would encourage your firm to elevate you and make sure that you are seen as a critical part of the team. And that's one way to show that there is diversity on the team. I think that for us, again, it's less about do we track metrics, but it's like a lot of things in life where once you start backing female founders, more female founders will come and pitch you, right? And so in the same way that wealth begets wealth, that is also going to be reflected in the type of people that want to come pitch your firm.
We have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Yes, back there. You have to hold it down.
Help? Great. One question for Professor Mollick. I am technical by training and, of course, my Wharton experience and a career in high tech. What does your research predict or show about the mother-son entrepreneurship model, or is the father-daughter an analog for that? And a question for any speaker tonight, which is interested in your comments on the Goldman Sachs new board member diversity rule.
So the short version is that any parent-child does have an effect on that, especially if you show them your engagement, right? That seems to be the issue. Positive experiences help a lot. There does seem to be gender role modeling, but it can cross boundaries. As we heard from our stories about influential fathers on daughters, it can work the other way around also. So I think role modeling to your children makes a huge difference in entrepreneurship. And they tend to enter the same industry area as you as well. So that's something to think about also. And I'll let everybody else answer about the Goldman Sachs initiative.
You should answer, being your ex-Goldman Sachs.
I'm really curious to get the founder's perspective about just, again, having gender diversity on your board. But I would say, my perspective is, in this day and age, there's been a real movement that as people get ready to IPO, they should have a lot of their board dynamics figured out well in advance of that. And what I mean by that is having an audit committee, right? Having probably someone who is a public CFO chairing the audit committee, having a board that's not just reflective of who's already on your cap table, but who will be a steward of your company for several years as a publicly traded company. And I think that it was an important message for Goldman to come out and say that they aren't interested in taking companies public that don't have a woman on their board, but I would have hoped that that would have been table stakes at this point as well, right? That it is a little bit of something that I would have liked to have seen happen without it having to become a requirement. Because I think it's important for good governance as well. I'm sure you can speak much better than I can as to the research shown in terms of public companies that have a lot of diversity in the executive teams as well as in the board of directors, whether it's appetite for risk, accountability, just of various characteristics that seem to get brought out more when there is a diverse mindset in those discussions.
I am still trying to formulate my view about kind of using rules or laws to enforce certain corrections. I don't know, I'm kind of curious to know whether there is evidence, for example, from research that shows that forcing inclusion of women or minority in certain organizations actually leads to better and more successful organizations. Primarily because like Iris said, I hope that things will kind of sort themselves out. Having said that, I think that you also pointed out to the fact that we need to almost like force that critical mass in order to create a positive feedback loop, which was very interesting. And so in that sense, if we believe there is a general, universal, better outcome from having more women that you actually quantified, then I can understand why you want to artificially induce that. And until the point where it actually becomes table stakes. And then hopefully you can remove that being a requirement, because I just prefer to have things done based on merit. Because then why not African Americans? Why not Asians? Like, why women? You know what I'm saying? Like, maybe it should be done for generally, like a lot of times I think when I go to pitch to VCs and I'm thinking maybe I have biases against me because I'm a woman, maybe it's the same thing for Afro-Americans pitching to VCs, right? So I just wanted to be part of a broader conversation. So I think time will tell how it works, but I think there is some, I found it to be really interesting how you said if you can actually drive that critical mass of VCs, you said, to about 25 to 40%, then that game dynamics that you saw happening will start changing. That was fascinating to me. If that's truly the case, then I think there is a real case to like push it. That's actually, I was sitting there like, oh, maybe that actually will change my mind around using laws to engender this type of things, because normally I would prefer systems to work themselves out, but that was very fascinating. So yeah, I mean, I think from that perspective, I'm actually in favor.
Yeah, and I will say the answer is the academic's favorite answer, which it's complicated and depends. So that there are trade-offs in these things. I think where we find social barriers that that stop merit from working, there's more reason to act than, and what I think we're compiling, and there's more work on gender in entrepreneurship than race in entrepreneurship. Just where we are right now, I think that there is, there's compelling reason to believe that there are barriers that don't have to do with merit, and that being very high quality may not be enough to go through them. But that's generally the problem with venture capital, right? So The average distance between a VC and a company to invest in is 80 miles. Right, so like unless you're here, you just don't get VC. So like there's a lot of talent around the world. I grew up in Wisconsin, right? There's some smart people there. No one will ever raise VC in Wisconsin, basically, right? Or like 2 or 3 people. So like I think there is just general questions in the bigger sense. In we're starting with gender, but there's lots of questions about access. Talent's evenly distributed, right? Opportunity isn't, and that's I think the big puzzle that we're trying to figure out how to solve everywhere. So. I think that those are really good points. And I think we are reaching our stop point. Maybe we can hang out for a second here so people can come say hi. I hope you enjoyed this. I thought this was amazing. Sometimes panels work, sometimes don't. This worked amazingly. I'm so proud to be here with you guys. Thank you so much for everything. And I think there's an outro from Carl. So
I have important stuff, swag.
The only thing that really matters. It's good.
All right, so terrific job first.
Thank you very much.
All right, so I think the only thing left to do is I want to thank our events team that pulls us off, as well as Irina Yuan, who heads our Penn Wharton Entrepreneurship out here. Wave, Irina. Irina's on crutches. That's what I want to say. And I see Allison. Allison Grant leads our events out here, so thanks, Allison. And so thanks everyone for coming out. Make sure you look for announcements and join us next time. And I think our panel's hanging around for a few minutes if you want to connect with them. But otherwise, let's declare victory.